Hello again, I am Monty. This is of course the ROG Ally, and I made a big huge pile of content about it before, during and after launch. Long story short on all that, I really like it. But today I'm looking at a community provided solution to squeeze just a little extra performance out of it, for free, without having to fiddle with custom power profiles or overclocking or any of that more technical fiddly stuff. And it's done so by forcing it to recognize a graphics mode it doesn't ordinarily do natively. It's something that perhaps Asus should consider adding in as a default option in a software update, at least if it works as well as some of the community seem to claim it does. I'm a kind of suck-it-and-see guy, so I'm testing it out for myself today, out of curiosity, and because I'm relying heavily on the Ally right now for my own gaming needs, so some free performance is pretty inviting. The Ally is in fact serving as my main gaming PC right now, because my big boy full fat carnivorous desktop rig had some kind of stroke and fell over on me. But more on that in some other videos coming soon, sub, bell, etc. But yeah, in the meantime, the ROG Ally to the rescue. But of course, it is a handheld PC, and it's running a custom form of an AMD APU designed for mobile life, and as such you can't expect to max out all your games. That said though, medium and high, or a mix of the two, is usually a pretty safe bet for a lot of titles out there, and sometimes you'll need to compromise a bit by dropping down from the screen's native 1080p to 720p, and maybe doing a little mix and match with FSR if that's available in the game. It can, will, and does run AAA titles really quite nicely. 1080p and 720p being the two default options presented by the display driver, and the only options as a matter of fact. That also means 720p and 1080p are the only options Windows will present you for your desktop, and the only resolution most games will present you within their own graphics options. But, according to community wisdom, we can get something that's visually very close to 1080p, but also boost performance by using a simple Windows registry adjustment. Well, some will call it registry hack, but that's being pretty generous with the word hack. But a regedit to make the display driver show other non-native resolutions as legitimate choices, say 900p for example. There is another edit available which gives you several more alternate resolutions, but today we're just sticking with 900p for simplicity's sake. And making all this work is as simple as double-clicking on a single file to add a new entry to the Windows registry. So, you tell me, which side do you think is the 900p image? Which side is the 1080p native image? Or have I tricked you? Are both these 1080p? Or are both these 900p? Or is one of them 720p and one 900p? Can you even tell without pausing and pixel peeping? Is it obvious to you? Now, of course, what you're seeing in this video throughout isn't exactly representative of what the game would look like on its native screen to the human eye, as I'm capturing this externally over a dock and HDMI, which, among some other things, means you might see some screen tearing in this captured footage that you do not see on the Ally itself, because the Ally has a premium FreeSync screen, which gets rid of that tearing. And of course, unless you're also watching this screen on a screen of exactly the same size as the Ally in full screen, the pixel density and perceived sharpness is quite subjective, but it should at least suffice for a like-for-like A-B comparison for the purposes of this video. I ran my tests across 8 different games, some with built-in benchmarks, some with regular gameplay, to see how much of a performance and visual difference 900p makes to 1080p on the ROG Ally. Mainly, I wanted to know if this 900p trick would be useful when I just can't quite get where I want to be with frame rates at 1080p native, but I don't want to lose too much resolution either. Now, in some games, even if it doesn't show you 900p as an option, you can do this trick anyway, because some games present you with a resolution scaling slider. But not all games have that, so having this as an option is still very, very useful. So we'll start with GTA 5, the benchmark, as it's one of those so broadly used for years now. It makes a useful benchmark, if you will. Usually anyway. Fact is, the Ally runs this damn thing so well at standard settings at a native 1080p, we don't really need the 900p trick here, but at 900p in the benchmark it does indeed look very visually close, and I'm seeing up to a 10% uplift in frame rates. Next, Spider-Man Remastered, a game I felt like I had to compromise a little more than I would have liked to in order to get a playable frame rate on the Ally. Usually I run it at 1080p with FSR on to scale it up from 720p internally, because I feel this game really needs to be at 45 FPS to 60 FPS to feel anywhere close to right. And at native 1080p with the medium settings, it just can't get there. And frankly, this game's visual style suffers a fair bit when compromised. And in fact, at 1080p native, with these settings, it can't even nail to 30 FPS, making it unplayable. Using 900p, it does, at the very least, keep us much more consistently above 30 FPS, even reaching for 40 FPS at times, a 30% performance uplift, which, as it happens, is the exact decrease in pixel count that 900p throws around versus 1080p. Some people will be fine with this game at 30 FPS. In fact, that's what it ran at on the consoles and its, resolution mode and whatnot. I still won't call Spider-Man playable at this kind of performance, but here's the thing. As 900p is the baseline, getting to 45 to 60 FPS will require noticeably less visual sacrifices and still look way cleaner than 720p, so still useful to have it sitting there as an option. To give you an idea about the visual comparison of 720p versus 900p versus 1080p, here's Monster Hunter Rise. These have been cropped in 1.8 times to give you a closer look at the character model. Don't know about you, but I sure as hell see the difference. Monster Hunter Rise, a game I played for well over 1,500 hours on Switch at sub 1080p and 30 FPS locked, is truly a beauty of a thing at native 1080p and 60 FPS on PC. And oh my god, you should see this thing at 4K 60. But this is a video about the Ally, and the Ally can't do that. But the Ally can indeed get to 60 FPS natively at 1080p, except for the occasional dips into the mid-50s, thanks to the FreeSync Premium on the Ally screen I mentioned earlier. You never see any screen tearing from this, although again, you will see it in these recordings. I've mentioned this twice now, because on pretty much every video I've made about the Ally, people complain about the screen tearing, even though I mention in those videos that you only see it in the recordings and you don't see it on the Ally because of the FreeSync Premium on the screen. That's 3 times I've mentioned it now, so if anyone leaves a damn comment about the screen tearing, I'm going to lose my damn mind. But at 900p in Monster Hunter Rise, we never drop below 60, meaning we can lock it there for a very consistent experience, and that's really where you want to be with this game. This game has beautifully precise and tight combat, so getting extremely consistent frame rates and frame pacing is very desirable. No Man's Sky. It's here because I don't have Starfield yet. No Man's Sky is a tricky one for the Ally. It's one of those games that starts looking really ugly really fast when you drop below the highest settings. But I also really want to reach for 60 FPS in this game for it to feel decent. It's playable at 30, but not great. So I've got it running here at what they call the enhanced settings, which sits between standard and high, and it's not super nice to look at in 720p, mushy and chunky. 900p is a significant visual improvement though, and while both settings dip below 30 FPS in the geometry and glass transparency filled spaces of my base, both easily reach 60 FPS in space. So 900p seems to be the right balance here. At 1080p, the lows become unplayably bad, I'm talking mid to low 20s, but 900p seems to balance the CPU and GPU needs of this game nicely. We only drop to the high 20s when inside the base, everywhere else it's very playable, without nearly as much visual compromise and mush as 720p gets you in this game. Let's go back to another canned benchmark now with Shadow of the Tomb Raider in normal settings with motion blur disabled. And while the more grounded art style of this game presents noticeably more softly at 900p over 1080, it's not a huge difference, frankly, and one that will go largely invisibly and unnoticed when actually playing the game. And it is, as you might imagine, a huge improvement over 720p. And indeed, it is once again exactly enough to mean the difference between keeping the lowest dips cleanly above 30 FPS, even if it doesn't do a whole lot for the highs, actually. Those few extra frames at the low parts really are very important. Second to last in my tests here included for its iconic bold art style, Borderlands 3 and its built-in benchmark. With this semi-cel shaded style, stylized art, bold outline presentation, it makes it pretty damn hard to see the difference between 900p and 1080p actually. But once again, at stock medium settings, it means just enough difference to move from sub-playable to decent. Now, as a fast-paced shooter, I'd still move to fine-tune these settings and scaling to get it closer to 60, but the point is, 900p saves a noticeable amount of overhead without any significant visual compromise, giving you more wiggle room to adjust those settings. And finally, Wayfinder. It's a spankin' brand new action RPG MMO, currently in a pay-for-entry early access, but it will be going free-to-play in about 6 months' time. It kind of works like Warframe, except it's a high fantasy setting instead of sci-fi. There is little sort of pay-to-win monetization crap going on, but it is PvE, so some people will find that acceptable. In any case, it's not a review of the damn game, but it is another game that wants at least 45 FPS to feel anywhere close to right. And also, it should be said, this early access game needs a big whack with the optimization stick. A game that looks like this should be running way, way better. They've got a lot of work to do. But at least right now we can still do a like-for-like comparison. At 720p, I can get where I need to be with the frame rate, but the game looks absolutely criminally harmingly hideous. Frame rate might be fine, but it's unplayably ugly as far as I'm concerned. What a mush. So on the Ally, when I've been playing this, I've been mostly running at custom high and medium settings mix at 1080p, but with an 80% upscale to balance performance with presentation. So that's what I tested it at for 900p as well, and it's the only one of these tests I did use any scaling for and not run at true native. And as you can see, once more, a decently close visual match with 1080p. I can certainly notice the difference, but if it's a choice between the softer 900p and the horrible 720p, well, it's hardly no choice at all, is it? There's a huge difference for this game. And while we flutter between 30 and 50 FPS, which is kind of bare minimum for this game, it sure as hell beats 1080p's dips below 30 FPS in combat. In fact, this game is so poorly optimized, when I've been playing it normally, I've been running in the turbo mode of the Ally. Unlike these tests, which are in the standard power mode, as have been every single one of the games in this video. Which is not ideal, because this is the kind of game you really do want to play in regular handheld mode for a nice long battery life, because you are going to sink into this game for several hours at a time. Anyway, 900p on this one takes it from unplayable versus eyesore into a decent balance. Now, I'm betting by now, some well actually type has left a nice little comment all about how this 900p thing is a very old trick, actually, in PC gaming. People have been doing it for years, and indeed, it is still used very often in console games, actually. And they're right, of course, it is a very old trick to shave off just a little extra overhead for performance, without as a significant downgrade in visuals as 720p requires. The only reason it's worth a video for the Ally is because, well, like I said at the beginning, natively, since launch, its graphics drivers haven't actually presented 900p as an option to select, until the community of users came along and slapped up a little registry edit file to get it done. And because it's not a native option, it's worth making a video about it because, well, then people know it's an option. So bugger off with your well actuallys. I'm a 45-year-old gamer. I know this is an old trick. I promise you, something as relatively simple as this has not slipped me by for all these decades of gaming. Now, editing the Windows registry can be frightening for the less technically inclined, especially if you're doing it manually. Oh, and it should be frightening. It's really easy to really balk things up doing it manually. In fact, you can effectively brick your Windows installation if you do it really, really badly. But this way is pretty safe and clean and simple. It is just a preset file ready to go. Once you double click on it, Windows knows it's a registry file. It goes, hey, would you like to add this stuff to your registry? And it'll warn you to, if you don't know what you're doing, maybe don't do this because you can balk things up. And Windows is right to warn you of the doom that awaits any mistakes. But in this case, it is a very simple registry edit, and it's been vetted by the community. I've taken a look at the file myself. It doesn't seem any, there's nothing sus inside as far as I can see. Just a couple of dozen lines to enable a new resolution mode for the graphics driver. And should you ever need to reverse it, it is just a matter of uninstalling and reinstalling your GPU drivers, which will overwrite these settings anyway. So, worth doing? Yeah. Your mileage will of course vary depending on the game's art style. Some games suffer more than others at different resolutions, but in general, and especially on the Ally's 7-inch screen in handheld mode, a lot of games will present at 900p fairly damn close to 1080p clarity to most people's eyes. And certainly it's a much better compromise for demanding games than 720p is. always nice to have just one more option in your pocket when it goes to fiddling with these games to get them where you want them to be visually and in performance. So there you go. Hopefully you found this useful. I certainly did. Thank you as always to the patrons scrolling up above there. If you did find this video useful, hopefully you've done the thumb and the comment and the bell stuff already, right? Right. Thanks for watching. I am Blunty, and we'll catch you next time.